Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, I just would like again to give the same note. If someone can come down, will be better, so we can have better things. We're gonna start as we start on time. We just would like to welcome Professor Ricardo Hausmann. I'm not gonna talk much about him because there is two gentlemen in front of me. After me, they will just repeat it. But I would just try to call Dr. Adnan Shahabuddin to give some word on this one.
I will say good afternoon. It's 5 minutes after, so good afternoon. مساكم الله بالخير جميعا. And I am indeed delighted to welcome you to KFAS, Professor Hausmann. And we are very pleased to host this lecture today. I understood from you that this is your first visit to Kuwait. Your program is full, and despite your long travel, I think we are all excited and anxious to hear you today. And so KFAS is very pleased indeed to host this distinguished lecture about economic complexity and the secrets of economic growth, which will be delivered by Professor Hausmann, who is well known, as you know, world-renowned, if I should say, use that word, at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where he is leading a center. I'm not going to speak too much because there's one other gentleman after me, his student, I believe, who will introduce him properly because he knows all about Professor Hausmann firsthand. But let me say that, to my knowledge, and to your knowledge, and to everybody's knowledge, economic development is an important goal of any society. And I think those who follow economics, they know that since Adam Smith's famous Wealth of Nations, many experts, intellectuals, leading economists, all of them have written about the factors that affect growth. And recently, in the last few decades of the last century and the first couple of decades of this century, those ideas have been formalized through a number of economic science developments, including models and mathematical frameworks. In addition, as with any discipline, multiple perspectives have emerged to answer the question of the factors that affect growth. And this question, of course, has sparked, and the way it's been attempted to answer, the attempts to answer that question have sparked heated debates. At one end of the diverse spectrum of this debate, the transformationalists underscore the need for a big push, big intervention. On the other hand, the marginalists emphasize the need for small-scale interventions, maybe gentle interventions, emphasizing the need for small interventions, at least at first. An example of that, randomized controlled trials. Before you really push through, you want to do some randomized controlled trials. Now, Professor Hausmann, as many of you have heard or known, especially the economists and the developments among you, he has made significant contribution to this ongoing debate, and he is leading that debate in his area of specialty. With the sharp decline in oil prices, we in Kuwait and others in the region, as you know, are currently at a crossroad. And we need to pursue a comprehensive approach to sustainability, to strategically address this problem to ensure sustainable growth. And we need to be decisive, but based on information, good knowledge, and good understanding. KFAS continues to make significant contribution to this and other development problems. Of course, our starting point is science, and scientific studies and innovation. So today we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Hausmann. As I said, he is a world-renowned development expert, and we are all very excited. I'm very excited, to be sure, to learn more about his perspective and his contributions to this field, which I hope will guide us in our thinking, in our deliberations here in Kuwait. How do we address sustainability, continued growth in the face or during and the low price environment that we are all very anxious, very concerned about. So without further ado, I think I will invite Sheikh Abdullah. You will introduce formally your professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adnan. On behalf of KFAS, I would like to welcome you all once again to this lecture. And also, I would like to personally thank all KFAS members for their effort to make this event a success. It is genuinely a great pleasure for me to introduce an individual who has influenced decision-making in both the private and public sector, in both a domestic and international setting. Professor Ricardo Hausmann is the Professor of Practice of Economic Development, and he's the Director of the Center of International Development at the Harvard Kennedy School. He has advised over 40 governments in developing countries, and he has served as the Minister of Planning of Venezuela and also as the Chair of the Development Committee between the IMF and the World Bank. His research focuses on growth, structural transformations, macroeconomic volatility, and international finance. But more importantly, he is the architect of the economic complexity paradigm, which underscores the importance of capability and know-how and its relation to economic growth and development. As a student, I have appreciated this new perspective, and I've appreciated this new lens through which I could see the hidden challenges of development. And we're very excited to hear about your ideas, Professor Hausmann. Please.
Thank you. Thanks very much to the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Science for this kind invitation to address you. Thank you, Abdullah, for that kind introduction. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here in Kuwait. This is my first trip to Kuwait. So I've decided not to say too many things about Kuwait, but I'm perfectly happy to answer your questions and comments as to the implications that some of the things I say might have for thinking about the future of Kuwait. I have been very much influenced by the economic tradition, which has asked the question, why are some countries rich, why are some countries poor, why some poor countries grow to become rich and others don't. And that is the question that started economic science, with Adam Smith writing the book on the wealth of nations. Now, when Adam Smith wrote that book, the richest country in the world, which was probably the Netherlands, it was about 4 times richer than the poorest countries in the world. These days, the poorest country in the world is probably Malawi. If we multiply by 4 the income of the poorest country in the world, you get barely to Haiti. If you multiply by 4 the income per capita of Haiti, you get to Morocco or to Ecuador. If you multiply by 4 the income per capita of Morocco, you get to Poland or Argentina. And if you multiply by 4 the income per capita of Poland, you get to Canada. So that today, the richest countries in the world are about 256 times richer than the poorest countries in the world. So if the secret of the wealth of nations could be revealed by just reading Adam Smith, why did a problem of 4 to 1 become a problem of 256 to 1? So there must be something that must be harder to fix. Now we know what happened. What happened is that if you look at the history of income per capita in the world, it looks like this. Forever, there was essentially no growth in incomes per capita, and then over the last 2 centuries, there was a spike in incomes per capita. But if you zoom in over the last 2 centuries, you see this. You see a situation in which some countries grew a lot, other countries didn't grow much, so that while in 1800 the gaps were relatively small, over the last 2 centuries they have split because something happened, growth happened in some parts of the world and not in others. So there's been a trend to attribute all of this to institutions. And there's a famous book by some colleagues of mine at Harvard and MIT, Acemoglu, Daron Acemoglu and Jim Robinson, a book called Why Nations Fail, and they say it's all about institutions. And that book starts with a discussion of 2 cities, Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora, 2 cities that are on opposite sides of the border, and one is much richer than the other, and they take that to be so like the beginning of their story, that it's all about institutions. But if you look elsewhere in Mexico, so those are the 2 Nogales. If you look at elsewhere in Mexico, the least productive state in Mexico is the state of Guerrero. It has a productivity similar to that of Honduras. If you multiply by 2 the productivity of Guerrero, you barely get to the state of Sinaloa within Mexico, which has a productivity like that of Jamaica. If you multiply by 2 the productivity of Sinaloa, you get to Guanajuato, again still in Mexico, which has a productivity similar to that of Malaysia. And if you multiply by 2 the productivity of Guanajuato, you get to Nuevo León, which has a productivity that is slightly higher than that of Korea. So within Mexico, with the same legal framework, with same exchange rate, the same interest rate, the same macroeconomic setup, the same financial architecture, the same religion, the same language, the same many things, you get huge differences in productivity. Could it all be institutions? Or is there something else that is still very significant that needs to be explained? So let me take 2 minutes to argue that growth is a really important phenomenon and that we should pay much more attention than we usually pay to it. Because as opposed to other things, growth accumulates over time. And exponential growth has some not very intuitive dimensions. And I'll just remind you that when you have exponential growth, things double every so often. And there's this 69 rule, where if you take the number 69 and you divide it by the rate of growth, it tells you how long it would take for incomes to double. So if you grow at 6.9%, 69 divided by 6.9 is 10. So you would double every 10 years. If you grow at 10%, you would double every 6.9 years, right? So, we take a generation to be something like 25 years. So you might ask yourself, how much income would grow over one generation, say 25 years, okay? Which is a distance between parents and their children. Or you might want to know how much income would grow between 2 generations, which is the distance between grandparents and grandchildren, right? So these are the numbers. If you grow at 1%, income would take 69 years to double. And that means that children would be 28% richer than their parents on average, and grandchildren would be 64% richer than their grandparents. But if you grow at 8%, income only takes 8.6 years to double. So children will be 585% richer than their parents. And grandchildren will be 47 times richer than their grandparents. So it's a difference between growing at 1%, grandchildren would be 64% richer or 47 times richer. That is a little bit what's at stake. It's a huge gap. And when we look, say, over the last 25 years of rates of growth of different countries, well, in 25 years, you have countries, say, like China that grew over 8%. So in the last 25 years, we go back, It's more than 585% the increase in income of children relative to parents when they were at the same age, right? And if you look over 50 years, there's some countries, say like Korea, grew at 6%. That means that in Korea, children and grandchildren are 18 times richer than their grandparents. It's a huge transformation. It's a humongous transformation. You feel it here in Kuwait. The generation of grandparents, this country, before all the growth of incomes that happened after the early 1960s, it was a completely different lifestyle. It was a completely different way of life. It was completely different levels of income. So you see a growth over time transforming situations. This obviously is Hong Kong in 1952. It doesn't look like this anymore. Now it looks like this, right? So you see what it does, the land reclamation there in the back. I didn't have a picture for 1952 of Kuwait, but it now looks like this. So I stole this from Abdullah. So behind these levels, different levels of income, there are huge differences in productivity. It's simply that in some places you generate much more income by working a certain amount of time. In other places, you generate much less income. So it's a little bit, why in some places agriculture is very productive, in some places it's much less productive. Now you might ask yourself, why these gaps in productivity? And economists have had an answer to this. They say, well, in some places they work with more factors of production. So for the guys on the left, he's working maybe with more land, he's working with more capital, maybe he has more schooling, and therefore with more land, more capital, more schooling, he's able to generate more than the people on the right. When economists have tried to explain growth using this explanation, they found that this is not the answer. Okay? In fact, something else explains why the guy in the left is working with more capital, schooling, and so on. Now, this is a little bit shocking because people have always assumed that schooling has a humongous impact on growth. And I wanted to disabuse you a little bit of that idea by showing you these next two charts. The first chart shows on the x-axis income per capita, GDP per capita. And on the y-axis, it shows energy consumption. And this is for 4 countries, Peru, Chile, Korea, and the UK. And you see that they all sort of like align on the same line. And it's sort of like, tell me your GDP per capita, I'll tell you your energy consumption per capita. No, more or less there's a tight relationship. Tell me your GDP per capita, I'll tell you your energy consumption per capita. Tell me your energy consumption per capita, I'll tell you your GDP per capita. These things sort of like go hand in hand. In the end, maybe the UK is not consuming as much energy as Korea because maybe the UK moved to finance and other services, and Korea stayed in manufacturing. That's more energy intensive, so there's a little bit of a gap there. No? Now let me show you an equivalent picture, but instead of using energy consumption, I'm going to use years of schooling of the labor force. And the question is, if you tell me your GDP per capita, can I guess the average years of schooling of your labor force? Or if you tell me the average years of schooling of your labor force, can I guess your GDP per capita? No. So, and this is the picture that emerges. Okay? This is the picture that emerges. So these are all countries, different countries. Let's take them when they all reach 7 years of schooling average for the labor force. The labor force, as you know, is the people between, say, 25 and 65. So it includes many people who got educated a long time ago before education was universalized. So the first country here on the left is Ghana. It reached 7 years of schooling in 1998, and income per capita today, at that time, was $1,000 at current prices. Okay? The second one is Thailand. It reached 7 years of schooling later, but it's almost 7 times richer than Ghana at the same level of schooling. The next one is Mexico. It reached 7 years of schooling in 1993 and has an income per capita of $10,000. And the following one is France. It reached 7 years of schooling in 1985. It has an income per capita 20 times higher than that of Ghana at the same level of education. So this notion that, everybody said it's education, 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 just improve education and so on, and then you get growth. Well, this suggests that many countries have moved up, they have not moved to the right. So it's not like Thailand did move up and to the right, right? So this is just to disabuse you of this idea, well, it's all about education. I've also tried to disabuse you of the idea that it's all about institutions, okay? So when economists were asked, okay, so it's not about factor accumulation either. It's not about capital and so on and so forth. So what is it about? And they say, well, it's all about technology. Now, technology for economists is a word that should have been invented by diplomats. Because diplomats are in the business of finding words that hide disagreement. Because they're all trying to sign communiques. And in order for everybody to sign the communique, they look for language that they can agree on. And fuzzy language is great because they can all go home, interpret whatever they want. And so if I tell you, oh, it's all about technology, we can all go home happy because what the hell is technology, right? We don't know what you mean by that word, so I can interpret whatever I want. So let me be a little bit more precise as to what do people mean by technology. I think that technology is really three different things. And we tend not to remember that it's three different things. The first thing it's about tools, right? And tools that are able to do things more effectively, more productively, differently, right? The second thing it is about codes, blueprints, recipes, how to do things. Now, I showed you that Malawi was 256 times poorer than Canada. Is it because they lack tools? Well, we can ship the tools. How long would it take to ship the tools? Can't take that long to ship the tools. Oh no, maybe it's because they lack the codes. How long does it take to ship the codes, the blueprints, the recipes? Well, you can put them on the web. It moves even faster than a container. So why would technology not have reached Malawi, explaining why it's so backward? And I would put it to you that besides tools and besides codes, technology needs a third component. And that component is know-how. You realize that because what do you do when your tooth hurts? You don't tell your wife or husband, as the case may be, why don't you download an article from the web and fix the problem, right? You have to go to a person that might actually know what the article on the web means, right? But it's a person that sees your mouth and can identify things in your mouth that you and I can't, and knows how to move their hands in ways that you and I wouldn't know how to move our hands. That fixes the problem. So that is know-how, and know-how resides only in brains. It does not reside in books. It does not reside in codes. It does not reside in tools. It doesn't take any other ontology, any other instantiation than in brains. It's a particular wiring of the brain. So know-how is something that is not learned conceptually. Here you have Rafa Nadal answering a serve. He knows how to answer a serve, but he doesn't have a clue as to what it is that he does when he answers a serve. He doesn't know how it is that his brain predicts where the ball is going to bounce, or at what speed he has to run or move his hands and so on. He's completely oblivious to that. And as a consequence, he cannot explain to you how to answer a serve. And even if he explained to you how to answer a serve, I don't think your game will improve. Because essentially, that wiring of the brain is something that happens non-conceptually through imitation, repetition, imitation, repetition. And that's why it takes so long to become a pianist. That's why it takes so long to learn an instrument or to learn a language. And that's why it takes so long for us to mint a PhD. We put them on courses for 2 years, and then they hang around forever until they graduate, because what they're doing is they're trying things out, imitation, repetition, until they finish the story. So that's a third component of technology. Now, the problem is that modern technology requires not just individuals to have know-how, it requires team know-how. People who know how to do different things. And it is the team that is able to perform the task, not the individual. Teams, coherent teams that know different things. So collective know-how, I'm going to argue, is going to be a fundamental determinant of the wealth of nations. And the accumulation of collective know-how is fundamentally related to the growth process. And the obstacles to the accumulation of collective know-how is what makes development difficult. Now, to understand know-how, let me explain to you, go through a simple example between a primitive person and a more modern person. Here is an Inuit engaged in the food production industry. Here is the Inuit, an Eskimo, engaged in the construction industry. And here's the Inuit engaged in the transportation industry. And I want to ask myself, who has more know-how, the Inuit or modern man? Well, modern man uses shirts, doesn't have a clue how to make a shirt. He uses glasses, doesn't have a clue how to make glasses. He uses computer and software, no clue whatsoever how to make any of that. You put modern man here, and what will happen? Well, we know he will either freeze to death or he will die to death. He will starve to death. But he won't survive. So there is no practical sense in which you can say that this man has more know-how than this man. But you can somehow say that the society to which this man belongs has more know-how than the society to which this man belongs, because the society to which this man belongs has know-how to make shirts, glasses, computers, software, and so on. He doesn't. It's not something that is a personal characteristic of his. It's something that is somehow in the ecosystem he belongs to. Okay? So it is that collective know-how that we're going to focus on and understand, how big it is, how different it is across countries, how it grows, how to measure it, and so on. So let me give you some more intuitions. So Harvard was founded in 1636. I thought to remind you of who pays my salary, so. So in 1636, that was before Newton and physics. That was before Lavoisier and chemistry. That was before Linnaeus and Darwin and so on, and biology and Pascal. And that was before Adam Smith or John Locke and economic science and political science and whatever. So because of that, when Harvard started, was started in this building. But with so much more knowledge, we needed more buildings, and now we have all these other buildings, right? Because we needed to store all that knowledge somewhere, right? Now, in 1636, a college degree lasted 4 years. Now that we know so much more, we have so much more to teach, how long does a college degree last? 200 years, right? No, it still lasts 4 years. So how has the system adjusted to more knowledge? Well, at Harvard, we created these 50 different majors, right? So we don't put, modern society is not about going from a society of people who know very little to a society of people who know a lot individually, but from a society of people who all know more or less the same thing, like all the Eskimos know how to hunt, know how to fish, know how to make igloos, know how to run dog sleds, to a society in which everyone knows different. And it is because everybody knows different that the whole knows more. So that is how collective knowledge grows. Not so much by the individual geniuses of people, but it's about the diversity of skills, or the diversity of know-how in the society that allows you to put teams that collectively know much more than any individual can know. So this has another expression in when you look at the products that people make. You can ask yourself, how many different people do I need to put together to make a product? Let's assume that one person has a certain capacity to learn things. Like you cannot become a pianist, a violinist, a violin player, and a great tennis player all in a single lifetime, right? So people have a limited time to learn stuff, to wire the brain. Malcolm Gladwell said that it takes 10,000 hours to become good at something. So we don't have many multiples of 10,000 hours through our lifetime to become good at something. So we become good at different things. So let's think of the amount of know-how that comfortably fits in a person. Let's call that 1 person byte. Not 1 kilobyte, not 1 megabyte, not 1 gigabyte, but 1 person byte, okay? So you can ask yourself the question, how many person bytes do you need to make something? How many different people do you need to make something? So, for example, all these products were done by this family in Ecuador. This is a subsistence farming family, and that's what they do, okay, in their subsistence farm. Do you know any family that knows how to make these products? And you could say that today, no nation knows how to make this product. This is the 787 done by Boeing, a company that has 165,000 employees. With 165,000 employees, this company makes fewer than 15% of the parts that go into the airplane. They have to buy the landing gear, the turbines, the avionics, the this and that from a bunch of other companies, from a bunch of other countries that are all listed above. So you need an enormous network of people, not to make many airplanes, an enormous network of people, of hundreds of thousands of people, just to make one airplane. Because you need to aggregate all that know-how that goes into the product. So what modern technology has done is it has created increasingly complex products, products that require more and more know-how, but since our brains have not expanded, we need bigger and bigger networks of people with different know-how collaborating in making these things. Now that doesn't mean that companies need to be big in order to be modern and complex. This, for example, is a very big company. But is it aggregating a lot of know-how? Well, not really. This is a Chinese company that is making chicken parts. Now, we know that it's not very complex because we can take any worker, shift him around the production line to any other place, and nothing much happens to production. But try shifting workers in this production line, tell me if nothing happens. Because each one is adding something different to the mix. They have different bits of know-how, and you need all those bits of know-how to create the product. So a modern organization needs people who know about production, about human resource management, about finance, about accounting, about marketing, about logistics, about legal stuff, right? So you need teams of people who have a diverse set of know-how so that the organization can master the know-how necessary to make more complex things. So this leads to what we like to call the Scrabble theory of development. In the Scrabble theory of development, products are like words. They're made by putting letters together. So think of the letters as bits of know-how. So you make products by mixing letters, right? So let's see what happens. If you have a single kind of letter, how many kinds of words can you make? Well, you can make one letter, one word. But if I give you these 3 letters, now you can make 4 words. And you can make 3-letter words. If I give you an extra letter, now you can make 9 words. And you can make 4-letter words. So notice what's happening. With 1, you make 1. With 3, you make 4. With 4, you make 9. With these 10 letters, you make 595 words and longer words. If I give you 26 letters, you make all 450,000 words in the dictionary, right? So the more letters you have, the more words you can write, the more diversified you can be. And the more letters you have, the longer the words you can write, the more complex your production. So the process of development is akin to the process of accumulating letters. And that is going to be expressed in you being more diversified and you're being able to make harder things to make, things that require more letters, things that require putting larger teams of diverse people together. So when we go back to this picture and ask, why is this guy more productive on the left than the guys on the right? The new answer we would give is that the guys on the right work with their own seeds, with their own fertilizer, with their own tools that they pretty much probably know how to make. And the guy on the left is working with a tractor he has no clue how to make, that uses gasoline that he has no clue how to make, that uses genetically modified seeds that he has no clue how to make, that uses fertilizers and agrochemicals that he has no clue how to make. But it is because he's mobilizing all that know-how in his production that his production can be so much more effective. So it's not in him. This guy probably the only thing he knows how to do is drive the stuff and listen to music while he works, right? The other guys have to make many more complicated decisions, when to plant, how to plant, you know, and so on. So it is not because the guy on the left is a genius and the guys on the right are dumb. It's not at the personal level, right? It's in the ecosystem that you are embedded in that allows you to put these more complex teams together, okay? So, so this means that if we take this theory to the data, we can observe how many things countries are able to make. Countries that have a lot of letters should be able to make a lot of words. Guess what? Here on the x-axis, I have how many words countries make, how many different kinds of products they make. And you see that, say, the US and Japan are making a lot of products. On the y-axis, I ask myself, how hard is it to do the things that you do? That is, how many other countries are also able to do the things that you know how to do? And so for the poor countries of the world, they make few things and things that many countries know how to make. And the rich countries of the world know how to make many things and things that few other countries know how to make. So this suggests that the world looks a little bit like a game of Scrabble where people are playing with different numbers of letters. And while this is true for the world, it is also true within countries at the municipal level. These are different municipalities in Chile. So at the right-hand corner, lower corner, you have the municipalities around Santiago. And on the left-hand, top left-hand, you have all the municipalities where the penguins live. And this is for Turkey. Within regions of Turkey, there are 400 industries, kinds of let words that exist in Istanbul and not in Izmir, and 100 more that exist in Izmir and not in Ankara. Okay? These are Mexican states. These are Mexican cities. So this is a generalized phenomenon that places differ radically in the number of letters they have, and it gets expressed in the number of industries that they can host and in the complexity of those industries, okay? This is for Colombia. So we have used this idea of how many different things you are able to make and how many other countries are able to make the things you're able to make to create an index of economic complexity, which is in some sense a measure of how many letters you have. And we can rank countries and we can measure these things, how many letters you have. So the darker the color here, the more letters you have. And you see that the US, Western Europe, and Japan are very complex. By the way, we're only looking at those things. We're not looking at how rich you are or how educated you are, just how many things you do and how many other places are able to do the things that you do. You see that, for example, within North Africa, the most complex places are Tunisia and then Egypt, and then South Africa. In the Americas, you know, Mexico is more complex than South America. Brazil and Argentina are more complex than, say, Chile or Peru or Venezuela. So now, do we care about how many letters you have? Here is a relationship between how many letters you have, this is in the index of economic complexity, and how rich you are. In blue, you have countries where natural resource wealth is not very important. And you see for those countries in blue, there's a very tight relationship between how many letters you have and how rich you are. Places that have more letters tend to be richer. For countries in red are countries where natural resource wealth is important. So you see that relative to the number of letters that countries in blue have, countries in red tend to be higher up. That means that natural resource wealth is making them richer. And there we find Kuwait. It's a country that is very, very rich, but doesn't have that many letters, according to our estimate. So it's rich mainly because of its natural resource wealth, not because of the diversity of person bytes that there are in the country. This is, if we control for us, as statisticians would say, if we take into account the natural resource wealth the countries have, you get this relationship, which is a pretty tight relationship between how many letters you have and how rich you are. Now, it's not a perfect relationship, but it's a decent relationship. Now, you might say, well, you know, it's a decent relationship. There are errors or imperfections in the theory. Maybe the theory is not completely developed. But you might say, well, maybe there are defects in the theory, or maybe there's defects in the world. Maybe the world is wrong and the theory is right. No? And so let me argue that for a second. This would say, gee, India, what are you doing down there? You belong much higher up. You have many more letters. You should be richer. Well, maybe that's the reason why India is growing so fast. They already have what it takes to be richer than they are. They just need to sort of like take photocopies of the letters, you know, just spread those letters around and they will become richer. So maybe that's the reason why India is richer than it is. On the other side, you see Greece. You say, gee, Greece, how did you get to be so rich given how little you know? Greece, you don't belong up there. You have to go down to the regression line, no? And maybe that's the reason why Greece is in trouble. So actually, these quote-unquote imperfections in the theory actually predict future growth. That is, if you have more than enough letters to be richer than you are, you will grow faster and you will become richer. If you don't have enough letters, you better get letters because otherwise you'll become poorer. So now we just need to accumulate more letters. We need more letters. That's the whole point of development. But to get more letters, you have to face a chicken and egg problem. That is, to diversify, you have to start doing things that you haven't done before. But to do things you haven't done before, you need to know how to do these things. But how would you know how to do the things you haven't done before? Right? So you need, say, to make watches, you need watchmakers. But how would you find watchmakers in a place that doesn't make watches? Who would want to become a watchmaker in a place that doesn't make watches? And even if you wanted to become a watchmaker, who are you going to learn watchmaking from if nobody's making watches? So you see how adding new letters to the system is going to be complicated. And what we find is that the way countries diversify is by moving from the things that they know how to do now to things that are not too far away in terms of letters, right? That things that would not require them to solve too many of these chicken and egg problems at the same time. So we need to develop a sense of what does it mean to be, for a product to be far away or a product to be nearby. So we developed a way of thinking about that. And to do that, I'm going to present you a different metaphor. And the metaphor is that products, goods or services, are like trees in a forest. And products that use more or less the same letters are going to be near each other in the forest. Okay, so maybe this is, the tree for shirts for men, and this is the tree for pants for men. And maybe, not the same product, but maybe if you know how to make one, you can sort of figure out how to make the other, right? But televisions, maybe over here, right? Computer monitors, well, these days they look very much like a television, right? Now, how about chocolate? Well, that's neither here nor there, that's somewhere else, right? So that's what the forest is going to look like. And we estimated this forest by using a trick. If two things more or less use the same letters, countries that have what it takes to make one of them should be able to make the other one. And with that simple idea, we generated this space. Okay? So this space this is sort of like the forest, if you want. Every circle is a product. The size of the circle is the size of global trade in that product, so it's the size of the market, if you want. And products are connected to other products if they're very similar. So on the right, that green cluster is garments. Below that green cluster, this darker green balls down there are textiles. They are not right next to garments because you need textiles to make garments, but you don't need to know how to make textiles to make garments. You can just buy the textiles, right? So the know-how necessary to make textiles is not that similar to the know-how necessary to make garments, okay? The red blob there is construction materials. Then the middle blue cluster is machinery. The big ones is cars and trucks. Then the purple one is chemicals. Then at the top left, the light blue ones are electronics. The big blob, dark blob at the top, that's oil. And the brown blob, circle at the bottom, at the end of the forest at the south, that's mining. So products are going to differ in where they are located in this product space, and they're going to differ in what kind of things they have nearby, okay? In fact, products differ in two important dimensions. One is how complex they are, that is, how long is that word? And the other one is how connected they are, that is, how dense is the forest around that tree? How close are the other trees? Now, that is sort of like technology space. That's just a space of technologies, okay? It's an abstract space. What is a country? What is a country? Well, in this metaphor, a country is a collection of teams that know how to make some things. It's a collection of firms that can make some products. So what is a team? Well, in this metaphor, a team is a monkey. It's a monkey that lives on some trees, lives off some trees. No, it exploits certain products. So with this metaphor, we can now ask ourselves the question, where in the forest do countries have their monkeys? Okay? So for example, I'm from Venezuela. These are the monkeys in Venezuela. Those are the areas where Venezuela had monkeys in 2010, okay? All the other ones, there were no monkeys there. You compare Venezuela to Mexico, slightly different, okay? So you'd say, oh, but it's all Latin America, you all speak Spanish, mañana, whatever, right? Well, no, it's not the same. It's not the same, not the same, okay? And I can look into Kuwait. Well, so for example, this is the structure of Mexico's exports, okay? So they export oil, but only 10% of that, and they export machines, CPUs, cars, trucks, whatever, right? A bunch of other things. This is Kuwait, okay? So it looks a little bit like Venezuela, okay? And this is Kuwait in the equivalent picture than Mexico, okay? Now, by the way, I stole this from Abdullah's presentation. So, and in Kuwait, it's interesting to note that the know-how that is in the economy is, as you know, there are 376,000 Kuwaiti citizens in the labor force, of which 300,000 work in the public sector and 76,000 work in the private sector. The private sector has 1.6 million jobs, of which 1.5 million are expats, right? So the know-how that is embedded is really embedded in the expats to a large extent in the private sector. So that's just a comment on the... So we can look over time at the monkeys jumping, at the monkeys moving over the forest. And I'm going to show this to you by comparing Ghana to Thailand. You know, Ghana invested... These are two countries that in 1962 started roughly at the same level of income. And since 1962, Ghana expanded education faster than Thailand. Plus, education in Ghana was in English. And while the Thai language is beautiful, they tell me, I don't speak a word, but you know, very few people speak Thai outside of Thailand. So you can imagine that not only did they have more education, but education in English, they should have had a leg up. But let's look at the monkeys. So this is Ghana in 1962. They were exporting essentially cocoa and wood and some mining, okay? And Thailand was exporting, you know, same kinds of colors, rice, corn, vegetables, sugar, rubber, jute, no? More diversified, but all in agricultural products, some mining. No? Okay, so now I'm going to show you a movie of Ghana's and Thai monkeys jumping. So this is 1965. Look at the lights blinking, okay? So I'll pass it a couple of times for you to get used to it. So this is 65, 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, 95, 2000, 2005, 2010. Okay? Do you see? Well, let's go back, okay? So look around. There are a little bit more lights in Thailand in 1965 than in Ghana, but here's 1970. Now you got 1970, you got a monkey in the green cluster in Thailand, none in Ghana. And here, boom, there are all these monkeys jumping around the green cluster. And then more of them, and they start populating now to the left the electronics cluster. And now more guys in the electronics cluster. And now they start moving to the central cluster, producing cars and trucks and so on. So while this is what happened in Ghana, this is 1962, and this is now. So they went from cocoa beans to cocoa beans, cocoa butter, cocoa something else, powder, and some mining and so on. And this is what happened to their exports per capita in constant dollars. This was Thailand in 1962, and this is Thailand now. So a complete transformation of the things that they were good at. So, and this is what happened to their exports per capita in constant dollars. So there's a huge boom in the stuff they learned how to do, even though they had invested less in education than Ghana. Okay? And now Thailand is 6 times richer than Ghana. Okay? It is because somehow they managed to have their monkeys move and populate the forest at a rate that was much more significant. Okay? So this is, to the left we have Kuwait in 1970, and to the right we have Kuwait now. And you see that there's not much movement of the monkeys in the forest. Okay? There's essentially very, very static picture. And the things that Kuwait specializes in are things that are very uncomplex. The PCI is the Product Complexity Index. And many of the things that Kuwait exports are things that are quite unsophisticated. So, and again, this I got from Sheikh Abdullah. So, how do we explain growth? We explain growth using fundamentally 2 variables. Okay, one variable is what we saw before. Do you have more than enough letters to be richer than you are like India? Or do you need more letters to not to collapse like Greece? Okay, so that's one dimension. The second dimension is this other dimension. How many letters you have is on the x-axis. The y-axis is how close are your monkeys from empty trees. If you're producing oil and you're at the end of the world at the top of the map, you don't have many trees near you. If you are in those dense parts of the forest, now you have many trees around you. So how many trees are around you is on the y-axis. So there are some countries that have very few letters, and all monkeys are in the periphery, so they have no nearby trees. It's very hard for those monkeys to move. There are other countries that have many, many letters, but the monkeys have taken all the forest, so there are no empty trees left. So those are the guys on the right. In the middle, there are some guys who have enough trees so that there are plenty of trees to move to that are near where they are. And India is also at the top there, but also Greece is at the top there. So Greece might need more letters, but Greece is in a position in the product space that makes it relatively easy for them to move around. Okay. So with these two dimensions, I want to classify countries in a typical 2x2 matrix that business schools like to teach. Okay? So on the x-axis is, do you have more than enough letters to be richer than you are or not? Okay? And on the y-axis is, do you have many trees to jump to or not? Okay? So some countries have it easy. They have plenty of letters. They have more than enough letters to be richer than they are. And on top of that, it's easier for them to get more. So these countries are easily poised for growth. Okay? China and India would be there. Okay? Some countries have more than enough letters to be richer than they are, but it's hard for them to get more letters. So maybe they can concentrate on making more with the letters they have. Okay? Then there are some countries that need more letters, but it's relatively easy for them to get them. Okay? So they just have to get on this stairway to heaven by jumping to the next tree and the next tree and the next tree, and over time they will have populated the forest. So Greece might be over there. And then there are countries that have very few letters. They need more letters, but it's very hard for them to get more letters because they're very isolated. So unless you put the monkeys in a helicopter or you give them an adrenaline shot or something, they're stuck. Okay? So countries are dealt very different hands when they think about development strategies. When we look into where countries are, okay, because we have the data, we can sort of like look where is Kuwait, and unfortunately Kuwait is on bridge over troubled waters. So unless you have sort of like a coherent vision as to how it is that you're going to transform society, it's very hard for the monkeys to move. okay? So that's a message one. So when we ask ourselves, who is poised for growth? What does this predict about growth for the future? We find that, we're very optimistic about India, Thailand, Indonesia, East Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, Mexico more than South America, and so on. So we see different configurations, but not very optimistic for oil exporting countries, for undiversified oil exporting countries, because they had become rich on the grounds of oil and the price of oil and so on. And now, given the new level of the price of oil, the number of letters you have becomes more important, and they have few letters, and on top of that, they're poorly positioned in the product space because oil is so far away from everything else. It's not easy to diversify because there are not many nearby trees. So I would like to finish with a few implications that this has for some strategic thinking about a country or about a place, okay? The first one is, should countries specialize? Or should cities specialize? And, people associate David Ricardo, who was not my great-grandfather, with the idea that, specialization and trade leads to gains. But given the framework I have just presented, specialization is not something that you want to do. It's not something that is part of a development process. Typically, rich countries and rich cities are more diversified than poor countries and poor cities. And in the process of growing, countries don't specialize, cities don't specialize, they diversify. They add more things to the things that they're good at. They evolve their comparative advantage into more things, okay? So the intuition there is that, but, people say, but are you going to tell me that people shouldn't specialize? And my argument is, yes, people should specialize. But if people specialize, the city diversifies. See, if you go to a medical facility in a rural area, you'll find one or two doctors that are general practitioners. If you go to a major city hospital, you will find an oncologist, a radiologist, a dermatologist, a neurologist, and so on and so forth. The doctors have specialized. The hospital has diversified. So specialization at the lower level is what causes diversification at the next level. And the level at which it causes diversification is the level of the city. Okay? So that's my bottom line there. Second, should countries focus on adding value to your raw materials? Say, why should I export crude oil? Let me export refined products. Let me export petrochemicals because, why should I export cocoa and import chocolate? I should, So add value to your raw materials. And that has been a mantra. If you go into Africa, they call that beneficiation. And so it's sort of like the focus of development strategy. I find that vision is not completely wrong, but mostly castrating. That is, it is marginally right, but to the extent that it has partially right, it makes you think in the wrong way about yourself and about your possibilities. It's extremely limiting as a vision. And the reason is the following. You're not limited by your raw materials. You can produce many things for which you don't have the raw materials. Having the raw materials nearby is only important in two particular cases. That is, you need two conditions for having the raw material nearby to be important. The first one is that raw material is fundamental in the cost structure of that industry. And I would ask you, what is the raw material that is fundamental in the production of this product? There is no single raw material that is fundamental in the production of this product. And therefore, no one is near whatever is necessary to make this thing. Now, you might tell me, well, but gasoline is done mainly using crude oil. But here comes the second argument. The reason why it would be good to locate near the raw material is that it is very costly to move the raw material compared to moving the final product. But it just so happens that it is cheaper to move crude oil than it is to move refined products, because you can move crude oil in bulk, and refined products you would need a too complicated a ship to have the diversified products. Therefore, most refineries are closer to points of consumption than to points of production. But the point is that now you're looking only at the products where one fundamental raw material is key and moving the raw material is more costly. That is, you're looking at a very, very narrow part of the product space when you can have many, many more opportunities elsewhere that you are not looking at because you're obsessed about your raw materials. Okay? So let me illustrate this with the case of Finland. Finland is a country with very few people and many, many trees. So my great-great-grandfather David Ricardo might have said, you have comparative advantage in wood. You should export wood. A traditional development economist would have said, no, 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 don't export wood. Add value to your raw materials. Export furniture or export paper, something, right? And, you know, those things did happen in Finland. But the interesting story about Finland is that these poor guys were chopping wood and chopping wood and chopping wood. And, you know, the machines and the tools would break down. They would have to repair them and sharpen them and so on. Eventually, they became good at machines that cut wood. And from machines that cut wood, they moved to machines that cut. Because not everything in the world is made out of wood. And from machines that cut, they moved to automated machines that cut. Because cutting everything by hand or, you know, can be either boring or imprecise, right? And from automated machines that cut, they moved to automated machines. Because there's more to life than just cutting, no? And from all automated machines, they ended up in Nokia, right? So the story is not adding value to your raw materials, it's more adding capabilities to your capabilities, adding letters to your letters, so that by adding some more capacity that you mix with the previous ones, you can make a longer word, a more complicated word, and get into completely different markets. Because the machines that cut leather is a completely different market from the machines that cut wood and so on. So interestingly, once they got to Nokia, they couldn't jump to smartphones. And it was the inability to jump to smartphones that caused the demise of Nokia. So it's inability to add those letters. So again, add capabilities to your capabilities. Don't add value to your raw materials per se. You're not limited by your raw materials. Here's another idea. It's very, very hard to move know-how into brains. It's much easier to move brains. Okay? So if you ask yourself, how does know-how diffuses? It diffuses enormously by moving the brains. Now, in this part of the world, in the Gulf, there are many countries that are producing a lot with brains they brought from outside, right? That in itself has a very important positive thing, that you can mobilize more know-how. It has some complications that I'm going to go a little bit into. The first complication is the following. If you look at the history of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, they were all founded by people who worked at Oldsmobile. So spin-offs of successful firms are generated typically by people who were trained in successful firms. They moved out of that successful firm and went and started another company typically next to it so that they can keep on stealing workers from that original company. Okay? And that is how know-how moves from company to company. Same story you can say about Silicon Valley. There were some very smart kids who were hired by Shockley and Shockley Labs. Shockley was apparently a very obnoxious person, so they all left and went to Fairchilds. And while in Fairchilds, they invented the silicon transistor. And the people who then invented the silicon transistor went on to invent and to create all these other companies. And there is a direct link of previous experience in the previous company and setting up the next company. So know-how moves from firm to firm in the brains of the people who got the know-how in the previous firm. I mention this because I don't know exactly what are the rules in Kuwait, but I've been talking in Saudi Arabia and in Abu Dhabi and elsewhere in the region. And part of the immigration policy is, you can get a work visa if you have a job. If you lose your job, you leave. So that policy sort of like doesn't allow for the circulation of know-how being created in one firm, populating the next firm, and so on. So it's something to keep in mind as you think of the many things that go into immigration policy, which is rife with all sorts of political angles. This is an angle that I would like you to think about. We did a paper showing that the entrepreneurs that created pioneer firms in Sweden, that is, entrepreneurs who help the diversification of a region, come typically from outside the region. And this is not in a place that has low education, but no. In Sweden, that has the highest education in the world, entrepreneurs that help you diversify come from outside your region. Or firms that help you diversify are multi-plant firms that have their headquarters outside the region. We did this paper on Germany showing that pioneer firms that help you diversify, hire workers of a certain region within Germany, hire workers from outside the region with industry experience. So it's not that, well, to diversify, you improve your schooling, you improve your training. In Germany, they have great schooling, great training. You want to start a new industry, bring workers with industry experience from outside. Okay? You see this in the pattern of the evolution of comparative advantage with migration, where when migrants move, they move their know-how with them. And the place they go to become good at the things that the countries of origin of their migrants were good at. So you can evolve comparative advantage through migration policy. This is Franschhoek Valley in South Africa. Franschhoek in Afrikaans and Dutch means French corner. This is a place where the French Huguenots went to settle when they were kicked out of France. And so what do they do there? Wine. How did the wine industry move to South Africa? In the brains of the French who were kicked out of France. So how did the modern garment industry move to Bangladesh? Well, this company, Daewoo, wanted to sell stuff in Bangladesh, and they were not let sell stuff in Bangladesh because Bangladesh had exchange problems. And Bangladesh would say, you want to have me buy something from you, you have to buy something from me. And Daewoo looked around and said, there's nothing I want to buy from you, I'm sorry, there's nothing. He says, well, tough luck. So then Daewoo said, well, maybe if I make something in Bangladesh, maybe I'll buy from myself something I'm willing to do, right? So they decided, okay, what can I do in Bangladesh? Let's make shirts. So they took 126 workers, Bangladeshi workers, sent them to their plants in Korea for 6 months of training, and then sent them back to Bangladesh. 126 guys. Within 10 years, 56 of the 126 guys left the company and created their own company. Okay? And this is what happened next. The green stuff is all these shirts, all these garments. By 1970, by 1980, there was no one exporting shirts. And within something, it became the dominant industry in Bangladesh. And it was seeded by this Daewoo company that sort of like brought the virus of garments into the company. This is a project I did in South Africa with something called the Harvard team. And let me show you, this is the Harvard team. They're all very well-known economists. Danny Roderick, Federico Sturzenegger, who's now the governor of the Central Bank of Argentina, Bailey Klinger, then you have Abhijit Banerjee there, you have Jim Robinson there, you have very distinguished guys. Okay? These are the countries of origin of these Harvard professors. Not a single one in this picture was born in the US. Not one. Maybe since I put the team together, you might say I discriminate against Americans or something. I don't think that's the case. But you can imagine what would Harvard be if, the visa regime was different. Okay? So I say it because most countries cannot rely on domestically grown talent, not even the US. In the US, us foreign-born professors are in the majority. In the US. So there's no shame in that. Okay? So what are the levers to make monkeys jump? I've shown you diasporas matter, migration matter, return migration matters. I have just finished a paper on Albania where we show that the Albanians that went to work in Greece and then went back to Albania because Greece got in trouble, when they went back, these were poor farmers and stuff. When they went back, they, instead of, because of increased supply, caused the wages of the people who had not migrated to go down or something because now there are more people. No, they created jobs, wages went up. So it's because they went to Greece, they learned something different, they brought those skills back, and that was positive for the country. Okay? Foreign direct investment and joint ventures and so on are another way to bring letters into the country. We have a paper that shows that companies that hired workers that worked in multinational companies in Brazil, the productivity of those companies went up. So you have the multinational comes in, they hire some workers, those workers move around and they raise the productivity of the next firm. So, and then there's the idea of mergers and acquisitions, which is an idea that poor countries cannot do, but Kuwait could do. And Kuwait does, but I don't know to what extent it does it in the strategic sense I mean it. When Google says, I would like to stream video on the web. Say, gee, I don't know how to stream video on the web. What do? Do they create an R&D department to stream video on the web? Or do they go out and buy YouTube? So they went out and bought YouTube. So sometimes when you have a certain skill or a certain industry that you would like your country to be able to get into, you just buy it. You just buy it, and then you try to reconfigure the company so that some of it spills back to your country. So as the Kuwait Investment Authority thinks about its mandate and so on, if a small, very small fraction, 2-3% of that portfolio were invested with this criteria, it might help some monkeys move around more quickly, okay? So these are some of the ideas that I wanted to share with you. I've tried to share with you a certain way of thinking about what really is the secret of the wealth of nations, how it is that countries grow, how it is that you think about promoting development. And you have a great hand to play. Play it well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hausmann, for that enlightening lecture. We will open the floor to a couple of questions. And if you could please introduce yourself. Please, Dr. Mohammed.
Well, Professor Hausmann, I'd like to again reiterate what Professor Adnan Shahabuddin and welcoming you to Kuwait, and we are all glad that you are joining us for the first time here in Kuwait. We are, in effect, all students of your grandfather, Ricardo. And most importantly, we learned that, to be an economist, if reality in front of your eyes do not fit theory, then reality is wrong. It has to fit theory. And what you have shown us is something very remarkable, that reality in a lot of cases do not fit theory. And I would like to ask you three things very quickly. First, some of your colleagues, and we have seen Danny Roderick, and you took to South Africa, and Barrow have done zillions of regressions, and they attributed basically most of these regressions, about 50% of the GDP, per capita GDP, can be attributed to basically two things: fertility and secondary schooling. How does that fit with this model? And the second point is the argument that the debate that we have seen having taking place between Echmoglu and Sachs, in which Sachs tends to emphasize the role of geography, the role of geography in economic growth. I don't see that geography is important in this complexity index. Southeast Asia, for example, all the countries, the tigers have, the tide left everybody there. Is geography has something to do with it, to be the proximity of the centers of economic growth? And thirdly, something that you have written a lot about, but you have not mentioned at all, and it's very relevant to us here in Kuwait, something that you have done in the area of Dutch disease and resource curse. Is it symmetrical when oil prices go down that we are in a better position now? From your own experience in Venezuela, what can you tell us here in Kuwait? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much for those questions. Let me tell you my two thoughts on the issues of fertility and secondary schooling. It is the case that rich countries have more secondary schooling than poor countries. It is the case that rich countries tend to have lower fertility than poor countries. So if you do a cross-section across countries at a certain point in time, you find that relationship. But when you look at that relationship at two different points in time, what you find is that fertility has declined everywhere, but countries have not increased their income as you would have expected from the relationship between fertility and income. And secondary schooling has increased everywhere, and countries have not moved according to the line that connects secondary schooling to income, at least according to the original estimation. So for example, a country like Turkey in 2010 had significantly more education, secondary, tertiary education, and significantly lower fertility than the Netherlands had in 1960. Not only that, in 2010, Turkey had access to much more modern technology than the Netherlands had in 1960. So with more education, lower fertility, and 50 years more advanced technology than the Netherlands, in 2010, Turkey's income per capita was half the income per capita of the Netherlands in 1960. This gives you a sense of how, the magnitude of the difference. So I would put it to you that fertility has declined everywhere, education has gone up everywhere, and incomes have not been moving at all to the extent that you would have inferred from the cross-section. So the cross-section does not explain the time series. That's with respect to the first point. With respect to the second point, I think that geography does come in, but I like to see geography coming in a little bit through the communication channel, the transportation channel that I'll touch next, but most importantly through a channel that Jared Diamond mentioned in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which goes very much into my story. What Jared Diamond says is that, he says, look at Eurasia. Eurasia is a continent that has an east-west layout. And look at Africa and the Americas. They have a north-south layout. And you would say, who cares? East, west, north, south, same story, no? He says, no, because east-west climate changes very little. North, south, climate changes a lot. So this means that in the time in which humans depended mostly on agriculture, any agricultural innovation, any plant that got domesticated or any animal that got domesticated at a certain latitude in Eurasia, that innovation could move east-west, people could learn and adopt that technology. While in the Americas and in Africa, since they have this north-south layout, you domesticate a plant or an animal at a certain latitude, it moves very little down or up because climate is changing. As a consequence, Jared Diamond argues, people in Eurasia had access to much more diverse technologies. They had access to wheat, to barley, to rice, to pigs, to horses, to donkeys, to cows, to goats, etc., that were domesticated in very different points in that landmass, but that could move around because climate didn't change. So I had a student I was advising, who's now just graduated with a PhD from Brown, is now a professor in BU. He did a paper on the US showing, he looked at the diversity of agricultural production by county in the US in 1880. Okay? How diverse was agricultural production in 1880 in that county? And he correlated that with how industrialized had it become by 1950. And what he found is that places where you had people mastering different agricultural technologies were able to adopt manufacturing much earlier and more intensely. So I think that geography connects, but it connects through the way it facilitates or does not facilitate people's accumulation of skills and know-how, okay? So I think it still goes through my channel, even though there might be a geographical determinant of what makes it easier or hard. And secondly, communication, I think, matters a lot. I have a paper that was published, I think, in January 2013 or 2014 in the Journal of International Economics that says the following. You know, my great-grandfather, David Ricardo, says, if you have a neighbor that is good at something, trade with him. So what we asked ourselves is, if I have a neighbor that is good at something, do I trade for something with him, or do I learn from him and also become good at what he's good at? And what we found is that you learn from your neighbors. Even though your neighbors are right there and transportation costs are lower, so he would have a competitive advantage and beat you, not let you get in. If you have a neighbor that knows how to make something, you learn from him. So communication is also important in the diffusion of know-how. And so I do think that geography matters, but I would say it matters a lot through the channels I have been expounding. And finally, with the issue of the decline in the price of oil, my colleague Danny Roderick has a paper showing that short-term depreciations have a long-term effect in countries diversifying and the monkeys jumping. And we actually have two papers, Danny Roderick and I. One is called, Economic Development as Self-Discovery, and the other one is called What You Export Matters, where we show why this would be the case. That is why, if you have a temporary period in which, the real exchange rate might have depreciated, maybe because you had a balance of payments problem and you had to devalue or something, that in those periods, people look around, new things that they might be able to do. They find the tree. The monkeys sort of like get thrown off the tree they were in. So the monkeys look around for the next tree, and if they find a successful tree, that tree can then become an important source of growth for the next time over. So I do believe that, as they say, don't let a good crisis go to waste. That moments of difficulty may be moments that help you define a new course.
Thank you very much, Professor. Please introduce yourself before you ask the question, please. Please.
دكتور مصطفى باباني In Kuwait, if we have so many products, we will have problem with the population.
So many what, sorry?
Laborers to bring different certification. So we'll have problem because we become minority. So we are limited on that. So the Kuwaitis maybe don't accept that. But Kuwait has made so many things by investing abroad through the funds. So I think you have to analyze also our funds. How did we had so many choices, like we have ownership in some cars in Europe. The second thing about
We just can have one question because
Yeah,
we are going to
just
have
last one,
space
yeah.
for the other, please.
the stability. If you have the forest and it goes on fire, you know, we have a lot of fires in the Middle East. Europe, for instance, when they had First World War, Second World War, they went down. So where was the stability? It was in United States, Europe. The same thing in Far East. They develop after they finish. Japan, for instance. So also the disturbance will affect the economic growth.
Thank you.
We'll take another couple of questions, if that's okay, please.
Anwar Sharahan. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. It was very informative. I just want to ask you concerning the diversification of the economy. Now, as you know, the oil prices is a commodity. You know, last year is 120, and now we are within the 30. So 90% or more of the Kuwaiti income is coming from selling the oil. Now, what did you advise us and to diversify our economy, not to be independent in one single commodity, which is the oil? And if we kept our money within foreign investment, which is will be affected by the inflation, whatever your country being invested this money in. And the idea I would mention about the acquisition and the mergers, you mentioned about to use some of these 6 or 7% of the foreign investment of Kuwait. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to have a question from there, please.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Hausmann, for that enlightening presentation. My name is Firas Sarad. I'm the World Bank country manager in Kuwait. I wanted to ask you a question about the letters. I think the process of adding letters typically happens in an ecosystem, as you mentioned. And for that ecosystem to grow effectively, some people would argue that you need institutions and policies. At the beginning of your presentation, I think you made the point that institutions, maybe in policies, don't matter that much. And I'd just like you to perhaps elaborate a little bit more about why.
Okay, thank you. We'll let the professor respond to these couple of questions, and then we'll go for another round.
Very good. So the issue that the first question was, you know, in Kuwait, we are already bringing a lot of people in. We don't want to become an even smaller minority. So instead of developing things here, why don't we just invest abroad? And, you know, again, I don't want to make choices or decisions for Kuwaitis, and I understand the issue. I would say that in many countries, what the goal of policy is to have good quality jobs for the people in the country. I just came from Saudi Arabia, and their problem is that, you know, while they have something like 10 million expats, they have high unemployment of the Saudis, and the issue is there are not enough jobs that the Saudis are willing to accept, and there's high unemployment. So the goal of policy is to generate good jobs in the country. Now, many times you need all sorts of a mix of skills in a company. And so you might have the good jobs for the Saudis, but then you may have low-skilled jobs that you can bring people from outside to work in. And there are some countries that don't like to have people from outside come in because it changes the nature of the society and the balances that they want to keep, etc. So one example I would put to you is the case of Israel. Israel also doesn't like to have too many people come into the country because it changes the character of the country. And they have some ideas for business ideas and so on. So if you look at the balance of payments of Israel, there's a line that they called fabrication-less firms or fabless firms. These are firms where the product was designed in Israel, was conceived in Israel, was branded in Israel, marketed in Israel, made in India or made in Pakistan or made in China. And so in the balance of payments, what you get, you don't see the exports because the goods never left Israel, right? But you see the net income generated by those companies that comes back to Israel. That, in the balance of payments, last time I checked, was something on the order of $25 billion or so. So it's a lot, it's a very significant activity that is remunerating the part of the value chain that gets done here. So you don't need to necessarily put the manufacturing part in the country. You can leave the manufacturing part in places where labor is cheaper, but you can have all those higher end jobs of that value chain in the country. I'm just mentioning as one intermediate situation between those two. So the second question by Anwar Shah was on diversification and where to diversify into given the decline in the price of oil. I am impressed at the way Dubai has thought about the question. Because instead of saying, well, we are having less oil now, what are we going to do? Because they knew that oil was going to run out in Dubai. Well, they said, well, because we have oil, we're rich. Because we're rich, we have good infrastructure, we have good airports, good roads, golf courses, this, that, and the other. Guess what? Tourists also like that. Guess what? Businesses also like that. So maybe become a tourist destination, a business hub destination, a logistic destination, a transport destination, and there you have Emirates, and you have the ports of Dubai, and so on. A set of activities that was not about adding value to your raw materials, but about the logic that given that fact that I have oil, I bought these other things. Now that I have this, what else can I do with that? So I'm very impressed at the fact that Qatar is important in the media industry. They're now getting into sports. And so I see a lot of action in people, getting into more modern, dynamic industries that could be a source of diversification. Then the question from the World Bank. The people that push the institutional agenda, we're not saying, obviously, I would say that institutions is like technology. It's a word that should have been invented by diplomats because people mean anything by institutions. But part of the idea of what people meant by institutions is it was sort of like the fundamental rules of the game that the country would adopt and so on. And even if you read Acemoglu and Robinson, they would say, and these things were determined centuries ago and there's nothing you can do about it anyway. I presented the case of Mexico just to show how many degrees of freedom are within a basic institutional setting. So there's plenty of things to do within a basic constitutional setting. There are more degrees of freedom than you think. So the way I think about institutions and policies is I see the government as a provider of letters. And goods are made with some combination, products are made with some combination of things you can buy in the market, say private goods, right? And things that are provided by governments. And if a word uses letters that are typically provided by governments or that the government has taken over the responsibility of providing it, and it doesn't provide the letter, those words cannot be made. So I wouldn't put the government as outside the sphere. He's an important provider of letters. Now, which precise letter is a complicated thing, because when I think of a government, I think of several million pages of legislation and several thousand government agencies. And problems might lurk anywhere in those millions of pages of legislation and anywhere in those thousands of agencies. That may be or not may be prohibiting the appearance of a word, maybe not providing the right word, and so on. So what we need to figure out is how can the government improve its provision of letters? Not necessarily for the industries that exist, because those are going to be complaining and bitching and so on, and they are going to be answering the enterprise survey of the World Bank saying we complain about X or Y. But the letters that are needed by monkeys that still don't exist. Because the things that don't exist never demanded public goods for that industry. So I don't see this outside. A lot of what I do is advise governments about how to listen better, how to communicate better, how to identify where the missing things might be that might trigger new activities or new things. So, but I wouldn't go in a country and say, let me ignore what it is that you do. Let me just work on rule of law. Because I find typically rule of law projects to be unfocused and be based on a theory of change that I think doesn't hold in real life.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Adnan?
Thank you very much, Professor. I want to maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit on what you started with. And you said that there is no correlation, and the data verifies that, between the number of years of school and the GDP. But are you saying that the rule there that neither it is necessary nor is sufficient, or are you saying it is necessary but not sufficient? And I want to push that a little bit, not just to school, but to science and technology, which is what KFAS is trying to do on behalf of the private sector and the government of Kuwait. And also add to it Harvard and MIT, which is right next to you, and ask a question. Isn't Harvard and MIT and KFAS, they are doing the necessary work to create an environment that could, but not certainly would, lead to adding more words, as you said, or alphabet, and I want to use the example you said about Nokia in Finland. I mean, I have seen so much work, research work, that points out that Finland did not go from the wood and the wood industry just like that by being creative, but because it created a very good science and technology ecosystem. And somehow the two work together. That is, if you didn't have a good science and technology ecosystem in Finland, it may have been much harder for Finland to invent Nokia and go into the internet and all sorts. So I wonder whether I'm saying makes sense or not, because ultimately, if it is not, maybe we should fold Harvard, MIT, and KFAS.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adnan. We have time for one more question.
Hello, I'm Riyad Bseso from the Social Security Fund of Kuwait. You had a slide where you highlighted the countries in dark red that you were expecting have potential for high growth in the future. And you mentioned, for example, India and Tunisia. But I also noticed in the Middle East, of course, we know Tunisia is facing a lot of challenges. And I noticed that Egypt and Jordan and Syria were also highlighted in dark red. So I'm understanding that you're saying they have potential for good growth in the future, even though they're facing, as we all know, lots of challenges now, political and otherwise. So I was just wondering if you can maybe elaborate on the reasons for that, in your opinion, why you highlighted them red and why they have this potential that you expect for growth in the future. Thank you.
Yes.
So I always, when I present this data for education, people say, I've never seen somebody who's in the education business destroy the grounds for his own job. But let me see what is the right metaphor between education and growth and production. And you mentioned necessary but sufficient and so on. Let me present an alternative metaphor, which is that you can pull on a string, but you cannot push on a string, right? That if you have an industry, say you have the beginning of an aeronautical industry, and that aeronautical industry is demanding a lot of engineers. Or take the case of Colombia. In the 19th century, the Brits move in with a mining industry, and the Brits needed engineers. So because they needed engineers, they created the first university in Antioquia. But now that you had an engineering school, well, then the engineers that were formed to supply the mining industry ended up generating the manufacturing industry. But you created the school because you needed the engineers. In many countries, I see education strategy as being pushing on a string, so that if I create an engineering department, and say I create an aeronautical engineering department, it doesn't mean that an aeronautical industry is going to appear. So I think that industries are going to demand skills. A lot of these skills will be accumulated in the firm. But you can speed up that process by pre-learning some stuff before you join the firm. So I would say you need this concentration on the industries that are going to be growing, so also so that you know what skills to prepare for and what is the channel. But there's a joke going around Harvard saying, what does a Harvard college degree prepare you for? Well, they say that it prepares you for an unpaid internship. And to tell you the truth, I have scientific evidence of that, because I hire a bunch of unpaid interns who graduated from Harvard College, and they are fantastic. And they're willing to work for free. And you wonder, why would people be willing to work for free? Well, they supposedly are willing to work for free because while working for us, they learn a lot, right? And that learning is extremely valuable. So right now you have sort of like a new source of inequality in the US, which is the best thing you can do after college is to go into an unpaid internship. By the way, there's massive competition for these unpaid internships, right? But the poor cannot afford to go into an unpaid internship, so they have to work as waiters in restaurants and so on, where the experience is not as valuable as if you can have your parents maintain you while you do a year or two of unpaid internship. But this gives you an idea of the enormous value of the things that get learned on the job. So what I would do is I would have a much stronger integration between a work and on-the-job experience. You see it if you look at Toyota. Toyota, they have, I asked Toyota, I say, well, I asked Toyota when I did the project in South Africa, why is it that in Thailand you hire people with primary education, and in South Africa you hire people with secondary education? They say, well, in South Africa we hire people with secondary education because we can. That is, given the minimum wage and stuff like that, I can get a high school graduate at that price. But if I can't in Thailand, we will train them anyway. And they have a training system, and one of the philosophies of their training system is that for every hour in class, you spend 6 hours on the shop floor. There is a deep integration between work and education. And that is something that has not happened in the way we have massified education. The University of Northeastern, also in Boston, has they have a norm that says you graduate in 5 years, but of 4 years of college. And in the middle, you have to do 1 year of internship. And I have hired Northeastern interns that are in the middle of their college degree. And I think that year of internship has an enormous impact and I think that was a brilliant idea by them. So I would also put it to you that the way Germany does their training is that they certify many of the things that get learned on the job, and there's a much deeper integration between vocational training and on-the-job experience. So all of this tells me that we have had the idea that if you send them to school, if I send them to school and new firms will appear and hire the people, it's a little bit more demand determined. If the industries appear, and they appear not only because there's the workers are here, but there's a commitment of the government to create those engineers in the future, then the industry will appear. For example, in the state of Querétaro, they convinced Bombardier and others to move aerospace facilities to Mexico. Not on the basis that they had a lot of aeronautical engineers, because why would they? They didn't have an aeronautical industry, but on the basis that they commit to an aeronautical school to supply the future, right? So that's another example. Was it, were you pushing on a string or pulling on a string? So, but I think that this is a super important topic. For example, I don't know if this program exists, but sending people on unpaid internships abroad, where you can afford in Kuwait to pay them and to negotiate, like Daewoo did in Bangladesh and so on, may be as effective or more effective than sending them to Harvard.
We'll let that slide this time.
And finally, or maybe after you send them to Harvard. And finally, on the Jordan, Syria, and so on, these are countries that, what we see in their, Syria is a sad case. It's a little bit like the case of Zimbabwe. They shouldn't be as poor as they are. They know they have what it takes to be much richer than they are. So the model is saying, you have more than enough letters. Obviously, in Zimbabwe, it doesn't know that there's a guy called Robert Mugabe, right? But the capability of the society is there, and if you sort of like fix the politics or fix the environment, it will show themselves. So.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dr. Adnan would like to present a thank you from KFAS.
Mohammed Salman, please.
First of all, let me thank you very much for an excellent.
Thank
It's
you.
really enjoyable. And if you allow us to just present to you something to remind you of KFAS and Kuwait. That's the secret. That you have to spend some time.
To do it? There is a know-how there.
Ooh la la. Beautiful.
May I hold it?
Sure.
And then turn it around.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adnan.
Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you in the near future, inshallah. Thank you.
And I have to go up to my office and then to the airport. But I'm delighted, and I will make a point to talk to you more in Harvard.
Absolutely.
And I want to follow up on this business of the role of science, not education, on the idea that it creates sufficient, that it creates a necessary, like what you said, that you need more engineers, you need things, depending. By itself, it doesn't do it. By itself, it doesn't do it.
No,
But I'd like to follow that.
But I'm fully in agreement that science is what causes science is beyond repair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We met in Harvard.
Yeah, I remember.
I was very pleased.